Welcome to Thinking Differently, new perspectives on media and education, or perhaps for today's purposes that should read news perspectives on media and education. Before we get into the meatier bits, tell us, who is Jodie Jackson and how did you become who you are today?
Well, the Jodie Jackson that is sitting here today is a passionate researcher, writer, and teacher of news literacy. So I have a deep desire to help young people be able to reliably navigate the news and make sense of the world in a way that doesn't leave them feeling totally depressed and overwhelmed by it. So I want to show them how they can use the news and their information more generally to not only help them better understand the world, but also help them feel more empowered and more capable to act within it. And this all started really because, well, the Jodie that would have been sitting here 12 years ago really struggled with the news. So I recognized that it had an incredibly powerful influence on my life. And I also recognized that it was making me feel really depressed about the world and really disappointed in humanity. And I didn't have the skills to make sense of the world without feeling totally disheartened by it.
Tell me about the Jodie Jackson who went to school. What was your experience at school?
I had a good experience at school. I made some incredible friends. I probably wasn't that academically minded when I was at school. There was a lot that helped me. But I do remember thinking when I was at school how formulaic it all was. There was a formula to what you needed to do to be successful, what you needed to say, how you needed to say it. And I got very good at passing exams, but I wasn't very good at learning. Or at least I should say I wasn't very motivated or inspired by learning. And it was actually once I'd finished my academic education at school, I'd gone on to do a degree in financial accounting and management, mainly because I didn't know what to study at university. And, I was advised, if you don't have a passion, pick a profession, which is what I did, accounting. And I left and got in. I remember my first accounting job, actually. And they asked me a basic question about debit and credits. And I just said to them, assume no knowledge. And they were like, what? You've just done an entire degree. And I was like, no, I'm very good at remembering things. I'm not very good at applying them. And it was actually that summer that I really found my passion. It was when I started researching or becoming aware of, the impact that news was having on me, wanting to find out more about it. I went back to university to do a master's in positive psychology to research the impact of news on mental health. And that was when my inspiration and sort of passion for learning really, really came alive, because the subject was relevant and interesting to me.
That's an interesting school experience, and I think probably one that is recognized by a great many people who will be watching this. And there's an interesting thing about the news there, isn't it? I was talking fairly recently to somebody at the United Nations who was talking about climate change should go on the school curriculum. So I asked them, to what purpose? Because if the purpose is that I will teach you what you need to know, or what I think you need to know, and then I'll test you what you've remembered, then climate change on the curriculum is not really going to make any difference. And I think the same about news, really. I think there are those subjects, for want of a better way of putting it, that actually where the outcome and the impact needs to be some form of activism rather than the certificate. Tell us a little bit about News Literacy Lab. How was it born? Where did it come from? And how is it developed?
From my own personal experience, really. When I was leaving university, I became really aware as to how much of an impact news was having on me in a detrimental way. And rather than switching off from the news, mainly because it's impossible to, I went on an active hunt for solutions to try and create for myself a balance that I felt was lacking. I didn't want to only hear about people destroying the world and, witnessing terrible actions of humanity. I wanted to have a different story. So I went looking for one. And it wasn't sort of lighthearted, happy stories that just made you feel good. I wanted gritty stories of solutions that were actually effectively addressing a lot of these problems that I was very overwhelmed by. And And that's when I started a website called What a Good Week. And I experienced such a profound shift in myself from changing my media diet. And it was so intense that I actually went back to university after I'd just left it to research the impact of news on mental health. And what I became aware of very quickly was this wasn't just my problem. This was a problem for a lot of people. So my experience wasn't unique. It was a shared experience by a lot of people. And there was over a century's worth of research around the impact of, the detrimental impact of the negativity bias on our mental health. And there was virtually nothing about solutions. And I ended up writing a book called You Are What You Read, Why Changing Your Media Diet Can Change the World. And this was kind of where I thought this was going to be. I was going to be speaking to journalism students, which I was. I was speaking, in journalism spaces, to newsrooms. But then COVID hit. And I have 3 small children. And I realized, even with everything that I had learned and practiced, I wasn't an effective mediator between my children and the information that they were exposed to. And they were so exposed. And I wrote a children's book called Little Ruffle and the World Beyond to bring this conversation, to my kids so that we could read about it and speak about it. And I actually realized at this point that what I was doing was a form of news literacy, because I was helping, at the start, it was just my children, but thinking about younger people and the way that they were engaging with the news and giving them the skills to be able to create a healthy relationship with their news and information. But my work wasn't really reflected in what people consider typically news literacy to be, because it's about sort of spotting and stopping fake news. And whilst that is an incredibly important skill to be able to have, because it is a very real threat, it's also not the only contributor to a misinformed worldview. And so I wanted to create News Literacy Lab to broaden what it means to be news literate, other things that contribute, as I said, to a misinformed worldview, like the negativity bias, like the pace of production, like the algorithmic priorities, and even the inner workings of our own mind. So how, not just how information is produced, but how it's processed. And so I became really excited by this idea of thinking, how can I package this up in a way that would be useful to my children and other children? And that's when I started the News Literacy Lab and built this curriculum to be able to help young people constructively engage with the problems that they hear about in the news.
So if I go back to my childhood, and I remember growing up in the Netherlands, watching the BBC News, there was an enormous, looking back, an enormous element of trust and truth.
Mm.
So I might have been upset at times or overjoyed at times too with and by the news, but it never entered my mind that what I saw might not be true and could not be trusted. So if I now, as the father of a 17-year-old, I see that struggle with the news is actually really quite complex now, and I'm sometimes wondering whether those involved in the news actually understand how important they are in terms of trust and truth. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, the word that really stood out for me from that was complex. It is complex and it is very complicated, our information space. And I think, gone are the days where we could use it intuitively. I think there is an education required to be able to make sure that we are using it in a way that serves our best interests, because the interests of the producers of information, and there are many, the production of information is infinite and rapid, with so many different agendas. And so it's really important that we just stop for a minute, set our own agenda, understand what it takes to actually meet that agenda, and then develop the skills to be able to move through this space in a reliable way. So I think that was the thing that kind of first stuck out for me. But from a sort of production point of view as well, from newsrooms, I think that there is definitely a commitment to, wanting to create a reliable product. But when you look at, what the sources of information are online, there are so many, and they all are committed to that in varying degrees. And so you have some people who really do take their ethical responsibilities seriously in the way in which they produce information and make it available. You also have people that don't. But the trouble is, online, there are so many superficial cues of quality. mainly, you know, ones that we, through our own biases, might mistake for quality. So, for example, we have a bias called the bandwagon bias. And you might think that because it's, you know, this piece of content has been shared loads of times, it has loads of engagement, it has a huge amount of comments, maybe someone that you know and respect has engaged with it in some way, we might mistake that as a cue for credibility. But what we look at, what are the other sort of cues for credibility, and why isn't this necessarily, why this doesn't necessarily translate into reliability? But again, it's having that vocabulary and that practice and that space to be able to break down these really complicated topics that we use intuitively. And this is all very invisible to us. And we can then just, you know, shine a light on it for a minute, help people understand this is why we think this, or maybe this is why we think this, and ask them questions as well to be critical of their own space. It can create a really empowering environment because, like you said, you know, we're not telling them what to read or where to get their information from. We are discussing it so that they're empowered to be able to make their own choices.
Which is still something that, and it troubles me a great deal, is that if we look, for example, at the current government does not want children to understand the news. It does not want politics taught in school, for example, because instantly there's an accusation that the lefty teaching professions and the lefty media professions will somehow influence the children into certain ways of thinking. And in my mind, that makes the job of the media world, particularly in the news sphere, and indeed of the teaching professions, even more important. Because an ill-educated society is absolutely not a good thing. So how does the work of your news literacy lab link to that responsibility?
Well, I mean, the thing is, you know, the news is such a huge, it's not an optional influence. You know, it's not, do we decide whether or not we want the news to have an impact? And if we do, well, let's learn about it. It does have an impact. It is affecting people whether or not we educate them about it. And not only that, but when children leave school, the news and information is going to be the thing that continues to educate them. And so whilst they're still in that space of learning and, you know, they're having this kind of formalized structure of being able to connect with subjects in quite deep ways, it would serve them really well to connect with this as an idea and as an understanding, because they will use it. It's not just, like you said, it doesn't need to be an assessed subject at school, because it's a life skill that they will use beyond school. And something that we're really mindful of as well in our curriculum, because, you know, democracy is often cited as one of the kind of main benefactors of news literacy, because it can help us kind of ignite our sense of civic engagement and engage and participate in the democratic process. And whilst I agree with all of that, speaking to a 16-year-old about challenging their worldview, changing their behavior, and inconveniencing themselves to a certain extent in the name of democracy, you know, this abstract thing when they can't even vote, isn't necessarily very appealing. So what we do as well, we create a person-centered approach through our curriculum and say to them, you know, this is about you, about your worldview, your mental health, your sense of agency, your ability to be able to act on issues that you care about. And the spillover of that is civic engagement. The spillover of that is democracy and a thriving society, because ultimately it is the actions of its citizens and how engaged they are within these, you know, within everything that's going on in the world.
Jodie, what exactly is solutions journalism?
So solutions journalism is a form of reporting that goes beyond reporting solely on the problem, so that we examine and investigate progress and the efforts being made to actually create solutions. So it emphasizes, you know, in-depth, evidence-based analysis of successful approaches to improving social or global issues. So in essence, it kind of helps us learn from what's working. And this gives us critical information, because by learning from how communities are successfully responding to problems, it helps us better identify and implement effective action. It's also not about ignoring problems. So by advocating for solutions, it doesn't imply that we are painting a kind of rosy picture of the world or saying that everything's great. It's about emphasizing balance. So it's creating a more complete understanding of recognizing that the problem isn't always the end of the story, and widening the lens to be able to make space for solutions as well as problems.
Jodie, you mentioned a report. Tell us about it.
Yes. So our impact evaluation report is called Navigating News, Nurturing Hope. And it was the findings that we developed from interviewing the students who actually participated in the curriculum that we designed. The report shows that the education program did improve the students' ability to think critically about their information and feel more confident in sourcing reliable information. But it also showed that it increased their levels of hope. And we then kind of looked at why hope is such a critical psychological ingredient to civic engagement. Because for us to engage with problems, we have to believe that they're in some way solvable. And it can foster something called active coping, where we actually move towards the problem as well as persevere if we don't solve it straight away. So, the real drawback of lacking hope isn't just feeling depressed. It actually lies in the practical consequences that without it, we won't actively pursue the positive changes that we want to see in our lives and in the world around us.
Jodie, why did you focus on the receivers, so to speak, rather than the senders in what you do?
Well, I have spoken to journalists and newsrooms about this work, mainly from an audience engagement perspective, but that's not really my background. I'm not a journalist. I began this as a news consumer, and I've spent a long time researching and understanding their experience and advocating for their, for their interests within this space. And so, that's partly the reason, but it's also just how rapidly we can change as consumers. From an industry perspective, if you're kind of shifting editorially, if you're bringing this understanding into how you then approach your own storytelling, that can be there can be barriers to that. There can be other priorities. Whereas for a news consumer, those changes can happen immediately. There are no barriers between you changing your information diet today. Once you've thought about it in a different way, once you've had different conversations, you've got made available different resources, you can make those changes immediately, and you can benefit from those changes immediately. And so that's why I've always kind of put this towards the consumer. And not only that, but we aren't just receivers. It's not like everybody else kind of decides what they're going to produce and then we have to wait for it and just receive what we've got. We've got a two-way communication system in our modern media environment. And actually, what we engage with, what we consume, what our preferences show, very often dictates what content is then produced. So actually, when we work with consumers, it's not kind of powerless, passive receivers. It's saying you actually have a really powerful part in this conversation, and how you decide to engage with the media will ultimately shape what is produced.
From the report, what are the findings that friends in the media business, be that in news or elsewhere, need to learn, need to take on board to essentially align with your agenda?
I think the biggest takeaway is, the media is such a as we said, the media is education to a certain extent. And I think that there is so much more that could be done to make this an understandable subject to young people from an early age. It's a very invisible thing, what it actually is and the impact it actually has. And I think if you brought this into children's programming, if you actually, if there was a Storybots episode on information, or if there was, there are so many different avenues to be able to begin talking to children about this from a young age, so that they can have their own resources, their own capabilities, their own references to make sense of this world, this new digital world that they live in much better.
Tell me, finally, what one thing would you like our viewers to take away from the conversation?
The one thing I would say is actively seek and integrate solutions or solutions journalism into your lives, because it does have such a powerful impact. And And it is something that you get from experiencing it. You know, you don't get the benefits of the gym by knowing about the benefits of the gym. You get it by actually going and working out. And it's the same with solutions. You know, if you actually engage with them, if you begin to connect with stories of possibility, of progress, of change, it can be really, really powerful. And this isn't, by the way, to replace at all any of the stories of problems. You know, there is such value in feeling outrage and anger and injustice and frustration. They are, you know, more painful, but very much necessary emotions for growth. So it's not to say that we shouldn't feel them. It's just saying that's not all we should feel, because actually, if we have those same feelings, but we combine them, so we don't replace them, but we combine them with feelings of hope, of optimism, of resilience, compassion, empathy, connection, that's actually what creates transformation. And that's true of personal growth and social and development growth. It's having that combination of essentially what is, you know, outrage and anger and optimism and hope. That creates a really powerful catalyst for change. So we're not by any means saying don't connect with problems. We're going to say that by connecting with solutions, you'll help strengthen your engagement with problems, because, you know, learning about progress and possibility, it doesn't soften our understanding of those issues. It strengthens our engagement with them, because once we know about them, the idea of inaction seems unacceptable, because change is possible. Progress can happen. And we need to kind of ignite and inspire ourselves with that information that makes us believe that too.
Jodie Jackson, thank you for pressing the thinking differently button.
Thank you so much for having me.